your own. Let's get right into content, shall we? Period 7A begins with imperialism. And so the forms it took are important for you to understand. There's a variety of ways through which this notion of imperialism, of denying peoples their own sovereignty, the right to make their own political decisions and right to their own self-rule. There's numerous ways that it took place, both in world history and for the American component. One could be outright annexation, see Oregon, see Texas, see California. One way could be colonialism, see the Philippines, see Puerto Rico, see the U.S. Virgin Islands for a while, even Hawaii for a certain extent of time. One could be direct occupation without annexation or out direct rule. See places like Nicaragua, Cuba, Guatemala, El Salvador, all throughout the whole 1900 through 1930s in many ways, where we send in the Marines, classic gunboat diplomacy. And then, of course, informal, with the threat of manipulation or intervention. We park a battleship off the coast to get your attention, or certain amounts of economic and political control through corporate or trade powers of the United States. What are the motivations in the groundwork behind imperialism? Two mnemonic devices that I've coached up my kids to use them. The 6Ds is 100 years old. I didn't invent that. The 6Ps I have used that I sort of created on my own, a variation. Whichever one works for you. What drove imperialism? Destiny, the expansion on the argument of manifest destiny to sort of a global scale. Darwinism, social Darwinism applied to nations, being that the strong have to survive and flourish, and in so doing, if they have to dominate the weak as part of that process, well, that's just the way it goes. Defense, the argument like the board game Risk. If other great powers are engaging in these sort of global actions and the United States is not, relative to those powers will get weaker, even if we stay the same as we are, because they'll get stronger through colonization and conquest. So maybe in sort of a keeping up in the Joneses way, we need to be a part of this imperial game if we're going to maintain our stature as one of the great powers and not become marginalized. Dollars, there might be trading markets out there. Democracy, the equivalent of giving an unruly child their medicine in a paternalistic sense. We're going to give these nations democracy because it's good for them, even if they don't know it's good for them. And we're going to give it to them by forcing it upon them, even if we have to, bringing light to that darkness of that whole white man's burden argument. And then as well, the deity, doing this in the name of white Christian civilization. 6Ps, same thing, just different letters for whichever one sticks in your head. Profits, money to be made, patriotism, population, we're expanding our economy, after the closing of the frontier, politics, paternalism, and piety, again, religious motives. The influence of the Turner thesis here cannot be overstated. Frederick Jackson Turner's argument on the closing of the frontier and the safety valve theory in 1890, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, argued that with the closing of the frontier, America lost this excess space for economic development, but also population absorption that was going to create internal crises for the country because we no longer had an outlet for the vast energies of this coiled spring that was the America. This theory wound up actually not really being true, but like a lot of things, for about 100 years, Americans thought it was true. And so that's why it's important, because it influences our thinking over a century on who we are and who we've been. Of course, the criticisms of imperialism come from the Anti-Imperialist League, the likes of Andrew Carnegie, William Graham Sumner, Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan, arguing that for a nation that threw off colonial yoke of rule by Britain to then colonize others is the height of hypocrisy. And it goes against everything the Declaration of Independence and American political thought has ever stood for. As for the Spanish-American War itself, my favorite line, you've seen it now in 3 of my 4 episodes. Wars do not always solve old problems. Sometimes they create new ones. And this is a classic case of this. So concern yourself with the Spanish-American War with causes and consequences. The Cuban Revolution of the last 30 years of the 19th century was a movement like all the Caribbean and South American movements, sort of in some ways inspired by the American Revolution, but more driven by the things that all people want that are yearning to breathe free, rejection of imperialist colonial rule from afar. Yellow journalism or jingoism, sort of sensationalized, ultra-nationalist periodical and newspaper circulation generated a lot of interest in what was going on in this Cuban Revolution. And of course, the explosion, and most likely accidental, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor provides this sort of a mistaken reason for going to war that Americans at the time thought the Spanish were behind this explosion, forces the issue and limits their McKinley's diplomatic maneuverability. This war has 2 campaigns, 2 fronts, one in the Philippines, which the United States dispatches with Spanish forces rather quickly, and then has to have this discussion about, do we want to front porch to Asia and the lucrative trading markets that the Philippines would bring, and then of course the Cuba campaign, which the war is initially instigated by. Proof of the dilemmas of this struggle would be in both the Platt and Teller amendments, whereas in the Teller Amendment, the United States, through reasons of idealism, proclaims a war fought in Cuba, the United States seeks no territorial advancement out of that conflict. A couple years later, after having thought about it, though, Congress passes the Platt Amendment, which stipulates that Cuba, while going to be independent, can sign and grant no international agreements or treaties without prior U.S. approval. So Cuba's going to have that same kind of freedom that you have in your house. You are totally free to do whatever you want, as long as mom and dad say so first. Now, you know and I know that isn't exactly what freedom is. And so the Cubans understandably generate a rather anti-American attitude based on this, as the United States as this unwelcome big brother from the North that will only let them do and not do certain things. As for the Philippine-American War, this is even more complicated, as the United States engages in a nasty little conflict in the Philippines where atrocities are committed on both sides, as Filipino insurgents, whom were dissatisfied with Spanish rule, are equally dissatisfied with the idea of being under an American master as opposed to a Spanish one, exhibiting in many ways the limitations of a lowercase d, lowercase r democratic republic trying to extend into a colonial empire. Open door policy on trade, which had met limited success at best, as we try to crack open European spheres of influence in China, all the while trying to use the Roosevelt corollary to create our own sphere of influence in the Caribbean, since the corollary says that chronic wrongdoing by Latin American nations would require intervention by specifically the United States to organize their affairs so that Europeans wouldn't show up. And of course, the separation of Panama from Colombia, which is probably Teddy Roosevelt's most blatant and aggressive moves in terms of exercising American muscle for an imperial cause in order to establish and create the Panama Canal on American terms, which in an engineering sense is one of the wonders of the modern world. The Great White Fleet, of course, representing this projection of American influence around the world, the ability to have a blue water or deep ocean navy to project power on a global basis, which is what all great imperial powers would need as a requisite. Not so much a large army as a large navy for that global foot. Let's review. Back to our content again. Populism. Populists and the progressives, the reform movement that preceded them, are different in some critical ways. And if you're looking for a compare and contrast question, this gives you a great example of something you can compare and contrast. The progressives, unlike the populists before them, were urban-centered in orientation and outlook. They were middle-class Americans. They were Americans who actually had gained some of the benefits and successes of the American dream. As such, they did not want to burn it all down in terms of reform. They were moderate in what they wanted. They saw the system as being not irredeemably broken, but in need of some tuning and repair. As a result, because of this moderation and their middle class, the fact they have access to some levers and influence of power, they do result in several tangible legislative and institutional gains. They were rationalists driven by research, data, scientific method. And to this point, they were on the inside looking around. They were beneficiaries of the American system. But as they looked around this world, the urban bubble they lived in, they saw things that were not so great. Poverty, class distinction, pollution, those going without who shouldn't go without. And so they're on the inside looking around. The populists, their predecessors, were rural in orientation outlook, and they were poor. As such, they had limited access to levers for change. Also, as such, because of this frustration, the goals they wanted in many ways were seen as far more ambitious or radical. They really wanted to stand parts of the American economic system on its head. Because they wanted so much, they did result, and the result is in minimal policy gains. And they were angry. We use the term lowercase p populism to reference this ever since. A movement driven by emotion, by a frustration with the status quo that seems to have left them out. They feel they are very much on the outside looking in. There's this Gilded Age prosperity party that some have been invited to, but not them, and they don't like it. So progressivism might best be described as a whole series of movements. If you took a paint can, popped the lid off, and flipped it over, and dumped it on the ground, that paint's going to spatter in all kinds of directions. And that's what the progressive movement is. There is no one interlocking movement moving forward boldly as a unified front into the future. What you have is movements in jagged various directions, often with tunnel vision, focused on the thing that they're focused on. For instance, there were advocates for public school expansion, getting more Americans into public education, a standardized system. Conservation movements that were focused exclusively on environmental protection, creation of wildlife reserves, national parks, resource management, irrigation, and forestation programs. Settlement houses, making life more accessible for that transition to the United States for immigrant classes in urban America. Jane Addams, graduate of Rockford College, Rockford Seminary Institute as it was then, is one of the more famous textbook examples you see everywhere. National Association for Advancement of Colored People, formed during this time as struggles for advancements in race relations, along with this first great migration of African Americans out of the South to the urban North, takes place as the Jim Crow status of the South cements itself into place during this time. Consumer protection. Pure Food Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, driven in many ways by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Moral reforms such as banning alcohol through the 18th Amendment, and also women's right to vote with women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment. Changes for working conditions, child labor laws, workman's comp, workplace safety. Empowering people to make decisions on policy. Initiative, allowing people to propose laws and have those laws voted on the ballot. Referendum, where the people have a law that's on the ballot, they will vote up or down that legislators are suggesting. Or recall, we vote you in, we don't like you, we vote you out ahead of schedule. Also, city commission and manager movements designed to challenge machine politics and have urban America governed by knowledge and expertise, by qualification, rather than political hacks and patronage and nepotism and connections like that. And of course, corporate regulation in the form of trust busting under Teddy Roosevelt, and later on under Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Trade Commission, and the reestablishment of sort of a central bank for the United States under the Federal Reserve in 1913, which gets the United States back into the central banking system for the first time since Andrew Jackson kills the Bank of the United States in 1836. The First World War, origins of American involvement, specifically back to content. Think about the cause of the War of 1812 as a cross-period thing. What got Madison sucked into the War of 1812? Issues with freedom of the seas between warring powers, specifically the French and British, when the United States sought to trade as a neutral third party. What got us sucked into World War I? Issues for the Wilson administration as a neutral third party attempting to trade between belligerent or warring powers, being the central powers of the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Germans, and the allies of the Italians, the French, and the British. And of course, the Belgians and Dutch as well. So you've got unrestricted submarine warfare as both sides. The Allies place a blockade on Europe, and it's very easy for them to do on the continent because England and France on the outside around the English Channel and the North Sea entrance, they can starve out in a world where resources, an industrial world, where resources are needed to wage modern wars. The Germans counter with unrestricted submarine warfare. The most famous and egregious instance of this is the sinking of the Lusitania. A whole bunch of you have seen the movie Titanic. It takes 3.5 hours for the ship to sink. The movie's about as long as it took for the ship to go down. The Lusitania sinks in 18 minutes. Time it takes you to eat your lunch. 1,100 people drown or die on it, including 124 Americans, about 40 children, I think about 20 or so infants. And so this is seen as an egregiously rogue nation terroristic act. And so the Germans, for a while, back off on submarine warfare, but ultimately decide American trade with the Allies could not be any more benefiting the Allies for the war than if the Americans were in the war with them. So ultimately, they decide to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And along with the Zimmerman Note, where the Germans make entreaties to Mexico saying, hey, attack America when we declare war. And when the war's over and our side wins, we'll let you take Texas and California, the whole Southwest back. Which, needless to say, when this is exposed to the Americans as the British uncover it, this is not well received. And those two twin pillars lead Wilson to declare war. And in his declaration of war, in many ways, this is a true encapsulation of progressive thinking. What could be more progressive than going to a wage war on behalf of humanity to end war forever? It's in many ways the culmination of the whole progressive line of thought on the notion of making the world a better place that could be improved upon. So as for war itself, the convoy system allows American vessels to safely be escorted across the ocean in large groups surrounded by naval vessels to defeat the U-boats. The Americans can also build ships faster than the Germans can sink them. The Germans in 2 world wars are going to attempt to test this thesis of we can sink ships faster than the Western powers, democracies can build them. In both wars, they come within an eyelash of being successful at it, but in both wars, they're not successful. The American Expeditionary Force, the first military unit sent overseas or to engage in conflict with the Europeans since 1812. The dead hand of George Washington's farewell address governed American foreign policy up until this time, this grand departure. And of course, trench warfare, which was in many ways a harbinger that was seen initially. The precursors of that, in many ways, were Lee's defensive campaigns around Petersburg late in the American Civil War, sort of a harbinger of things to come. Consequences, the war is over, the Treaty of Versailles, the 14 points. Wilson has this plan sort of ahead of his time for an international sort of convening body, a governance, not a governance board, but a convening forum where nations can work out their problems and issues through dialogue, to actually learn the lessons of history. Remember, Wilson himself was a historian. He's, to this day, is the only American president who had a PhD prior to elective office. President of Princeton University was a history man. And so he tries to set up a world to undo some of the problems that led to the First World War through having his 14 points of no secret treaties, no colonization, self-determination for peoples, no submarine warfare, things like that. This is going to fail as Americans have buyer's remorse after World War I and say, we really maybe should have listened to Washington after all. The Espionage and Sedition Acts, along with the Schenck decision, are part of a longstanding American theme of patriotism for a wartime effort often leads to intolerance of difference at home, because it's not a very far trip from I love America to I love America so much that if you don't love it like I do, you're just not a good American. And intolerance becomes the unexpected child, if you will, the unexpected baby that is born out of this warfare, whipping up patriotic feelings, which is going to lead to a fear of the other, culminating in immigration restriction. Everything old is new again. Culminating in immigration restriction and rollbacks of organized labor, a fear of communism, and the Palmer raids, which were a suspension of civil liberties in the post-war era for radicals and dissidents. Which leads us to the 1920s. What makes the modern era modern? In many of your textbooks, the 20s are called the modern era. Well, thing one is, like the world we live in today, an increasingly urban-centered world. Mass quantities of standardized consumer goods available for everyone. That starts in this age. The packaging, the style, the goods may change, but the world we live in today, in many ways, is still this same world, which is why this is considered the modernism. Think about your own times, the worship of technology, right? We all love the latest cell phone when it comes out. Can't wait, right? The latest Xbox, latest game we're going to get. Worship of technology is the idea that machines every day make our lives better in every way. This begins with the 1920s. Mass media, a homogenized entertainment, advertising, a shared common national culture that's accessible to be shared. Think of your own social media and how we can have films come out on the internet, movies come out on the internet, songs come out on the internet. Radio does this during this time, as well as the motion picture industry for its age. Communication, transportation, tying together these national countries and national markets. And as for politics and culture, the aforementioned nativism leads to a number of restrictive immigration quota acts designed to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia in particular. It's the era when the Klan goes national. The Klan expands into more than an anti-Black organization. It becomes an agency that is not just anti-Black, but also anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Jew, anti-intellectual rather, anti-Southern and Eastern European immigration in the name of the cause of preserving white Protestant Anglo-Saxon Americanism as they saw it. It's a divide between urban and rural that takes place in this nation, along with religious fundamentalism, culminating in the Scopes monkey trial, whereby you see creationism clash with evolutionary theory in terms of what's the natural order of things in terms of education and American culture. The Jazz Age, the 1920s, this is the era of this flowering and blossoming of culture. The Lost Generation authors, which you might have read about in your American Lit classes, such as Gatsby, Sinclair Lewis. The subset of that being the Harlem Renaissance, the outpouring of African-American creative arts and energies through the form of things like Langston Hughes, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, the notion of the Jazz Age and jazz being African-American music coming out of this time for a national audience, and the flapper culture representing new freedoms for women as